Good evening and welcome to NPPD's virtual integrated resource planning meeting. Thank you for attending. My name is Courtney Dentlinger and I'm Vice President of Customer Service and External Affairs for Nebraska Public Power District. We'll be recording this presentation so that we can post it on our webpage for others to view at a later date. We encourage questions using the Q&A feature. Please type in your name, town, and service provider or affiliation for any group you're representing, and then type in your question. For those of you who are attending at our 9 screening locations across the state, please reach out to the site host and they can help you get your question entered in the Q&A. We'll be answering questions after the presentations. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a little bit of background. Every 5 years, we prepare an integrated resource plan to serve as a roadmap as we identify potential strategies to meet future energy and demand requirements. The plan considers the associated risks and benefits to customers and seeks to account for the projected electric needs without sacrificing reliability, resiliency, affordability, and sustainability that our stakeholders have come to expect. Public input is key for this process. Tonight, we'll share with you the key findings from our draft plan and ask for feedback. You may submit comments, stakeholder input form, which is available on nppd.com/IRP. You can also find a QR code. Feedback is due by April 12th. On the website, you'll find other valuable information, such as the draft IRP plan in its entirety, dates of all the outreach meetings, and a timeline of events. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers for this evening, NPPD's resource planning and risk managers, Jim Fair and Jason Rosenkrantz.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for taking the time out to attend this evening's meeting on NPPD's integrated resource plan. I am Jason Rosenkrantz, and I am one of the resource planning and risk managers here at NPPD, and I'll be sharing the bulk of the presentation duties tonight with my counterpart, Jim Fair. So I have the task today to take you through roughly the first half of this presentation, and then I will turn it over to Jim to finish out the formal slides that we have to share with you tonight, and then round out the evening by answering questions that you may have. So in terms of tonight's presentation, we're going to cover a number of things that we believe are important for you to take away as you leave here tonight. We're going to cover what the integrated resource plan is and is not. We're going to cover the key principles that guide NPPD during the IRP. We're going to talk about some of the major inputs to this planning process known as integrated resource planning and the impact that those inputs have on the results. We're going to share with you our initial results, the insights that we've gained from studying the outputs of our planning, talk about next steps and key takeaways as we work toward the finalization of the IRP report itself. So let's take a little bit of time here to talk about what the IRP is and what it is not. Essentially, when we go through this process every 5 years, we're attempting to provide NPPD's decision makers in terms of our executive leadership and our board of directors key insight as to the most favorable approach for adding resources. Those resources may be needed to meet future native load requirements. And the entire process as we go through it is meant to minimize the costs and risks that our customers must bear. So there's a few terms there that I want to unpack a bit. The first being future native load. When we talk about the term native load, and you may hear that a number of times this evening, native load refers to the contractual load that is made up of NPPD's wholesale and retail customers. We serve at wholesale more than 20 rural public power districts and cooperatives, and we serve dozens of municipalities either at wholesale or through NPPD's retail division. In aggregate, those customers that take their energy from NPPD as their supplier collectively is referred to as our native load. So of course, it's important that NPPD construct a portfolio of generation resources that meets our customers' needs both now and in the future, and keeps an eye on the things that are very important to our customer base. We're going to talk about 4 qualities that we try to balance as we plan for our future resource needs. And essentially, the balance that we're trying to find is through creating what we call a directionally correct vision of the future. Directionally correct means that our executive leadership and our board of directors can count on the insights that we gain through the IRP process to be correct and make sense in terms of the decisions that we need to make for sure in the short term, but also be a good vision of how the future might play out and the resources that will best serve our customers well into the future. So essentially, what we're doing is we're starting with our current resource portfolio, and through the help of a computer simulation model, we're essentially going on a 30-year journey into the future. And of course, if there's one thing that we know about the future, especially when you're looking out 30 years, and in this case, we're looking from the year 2023 to 2052, whenever you look that far into the future, you can be certain that the future is uncertain. And so we have to make a number of assumptions about what that future might look like. And so with regard to the aforementioned native load, we need to make some forecasts for how our load might change in the future, how much it might grow. And so through a number of modeling efforts, through consulting with experts, looking at historical trends and future expectations, we construct those long-term forecasts. But we don't just construct a base forecast for things like load. We also have to bound the uncertainty associated with it. Because if we were only to create one forecast that represents our best estimate, let's say, we can be sure that in more than one ways, by the time we get to the year 2052, it will probably be incorrect. So we most often bound the uncertainty that we expect to encounter through developing what's called a high case and a low case. So essentially, we'll have at least 3 forecasts for many of our input variables. Similarly, some of the other key inputs that we'll talk about have to do with things like market prices. NPPD is a member of the Southwest Power Pool. It's what's called a regional transmission organization that spans from North Dakota down to the northern border of Texas. And we participate in an energy market that allows us to either sell excess energy to other customers within SPP or to buy energy when it is economical for us to do so. But the price that that energy may cost us or may return to us in the form of revenue is another uncertainty that we must explore. And so we'll develop multiple forecasts, high, base, and low, for things like market prices. The other major thing that we're going to talk about tonight is carbon resources. And so we have to develop plausible scenarios about what carbon restrictions or carbon minimizing environments we may find ourselves in the future. And so similarly, when Jim gets to the results and we're talking about that, he'll show you the assumptions that we made about the potential carbon scenarios that we explored as part of the process. So as you can see, when we have multiple inputs to this computer simulation model, and we use a commercial software package that is designed to give us the lowest cost resource portfolio for a given set of conditions, when we perform the modeling, we have to test various inputs. So we can test, for instance, our base load forecast, our base market forecast, our base CO2 scenario, but that's just one possible future. And the more variables that you have in your model for which you are uncertain, the more possible combinations that you need to run in order to fully explore the uncertainty that exists in a 30-year time period. So in essence, we run this computer simulation that looks at and finds the best resource plan for varying conditions over and over and over again. And in fact, for this year's IRP, if you look at the last page of the report, I believe you can find that on nppd.com/IRP, you'll see that we've run 54 simulations, each one unique in that it's a unique combination of the input variables for which we develop different forecasts. And that's why in that box on the right of this screen, you see that the IRP does not provide an exact expansion plan to follow, because in essence, it's providing us insight through all of the computer simulations that we've done. So let me explain how that works. When we input a certain set of input variables to our computer simulation model, as I explained earlier, it is designed to suggest the lowest cost plan that will meet our customers' needs under those conditions that we input to the model. And as we vary those and we get up to 54 runs in this case, for this year's IRP, we essentially have 54 resource plans that we can then mine for insights. For example, if we see through examining the results that the model is always suggesting we take a certain course of action with regard to one of our existing resources or a potential new resource, regardless of the conditions that we fed the computer simulation, well, you can rest assured that that's probably a pretty robust recommendation because it's the lowest cost thing to do regardless of how the future plays out. If, by contrast, the model suggests we only take a certain action under a very specific set of conditions, well, that's what we would characterize as a signpost, because in that case, the recommendation is really only the best recommendation under a certain set of conditions that we may or may not encounter in the future. And so those are signposts. So as we watch the future unfold, we can look at both the robust decisions and the signposts to guide our decision-making in the future. So in essence, what we're doing here is very much best utility practice. It makes sense for us to continually plan long-term for the future so that we can incrementally be positioning our resource mix to be the best serving resource mix that we can put together for our customers, but it also fulfills certain requirements. We have a contract for power with the Western Area Power Administration, WAPA. As part of the contract with WAPA, they require us to do an IRP. There's a Nebraska state statute that also requires us to do an IRP, as well as our wholesale power contract. So we are excited to discuss this with you today. The key takeaway here is the IRP directionally correct. It's based on very complex computer simulations that we mine for insight. not an exact expansion plan for the future. So as I talked about the assumptions that we have to put together for the IRP, we talked about putting together various long-term load forecasts, constructing different plausible CO2 scenarios, market price assumptions. All we're trying to do here is create a variety of scenarios that are credible and plausible scenarios of how the future might unfold. We're not here to attempt to predict or endorse any particular set of conditions that we studied as part of the IRP here. The results, the assumptions, the scenarios are essentially hypothetical. So let's talk about the 4 qualities or characteristics that we attempt to balance to the best of our ability through the IRP planning process. Guiding us in this effort are what we call our board strategic directives. NPPD's board of directors has come together and crafted a set of strategic directives that guide NPPD's management as we operate NPPD as a utility and as we plan for the future. In total, there are 11 such strategic directives. They are named numerically. So BP stands for board policy. The SD stands for strategic directive. The O3 here on this slide is strategic directive number 3. If you look at the graphic on the right of this slide, you see 4 characteristics of an optimal power supply. We want to be both reliable and resilient, affordable and sustainable. And NPPD strategic directives guide us in each one of those categories. So BPSD 03 has to do with reliability and resiliency. Each of the directives is a fairly short document, usually 1 page or less, and it lays out the goal or the standard that NPPD is striving to achieve. And in this case, our standard is to maintain a reliable and resilient generation portfolio to meet the needs of our customers. Reliable means that our generation and transmission assets are operating at a level where when you expect the lights to come on, they are on, and they are on in all types of conditions. That is what we strive to do. We have benchmarks for reliability, nationally recognized benchmarks for reliability against which we measure ourselves, and we have targets that we set out to achieve year after year. Reliability is a key hallmark of our optimal generation portfolio. Recently, the board also included the idea of resiliency, and it's a little bit different concept than reliability in that resiliency has to do with our generation assets having the ability to mitigate, survive, or recover from high impact events. And in fact, resiliency applies not only to our generation assets, but also to our transmission and distribution grids as well. But in the context of the IRP, we're talking about resiliency from a generation standpoint. And we have experienced in the last few years a number of high impact events either in our region or nationwide. Perhaps the easiest one to remember is Winter Storm Uri from February of 2021. Very strong winter storm that had great impact, particularly in the Southern Plains. Texas as a state suffered mightily from Winter Storm Uri. NPPD's generation assets, our portfolio actually performed very, very well during Winter Storm Uri and served our customers well during that event. Winter Storm Elliott, another winter storm, more recent, not quite as impactful, but still strong enough to gain the attention of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, our regional transmission organization, the Southwest Power Pool. So if we're going to continue to experience these strong weather events, these what we characterize as high impact events, we need to construct a generation portfolio that can mitigate, survive, or recover. So that is two of the characteristics that we strive to balance as we do our long-term planning. Two more important ones, BPSD04. This is the board strategic directive about cost competitiveness. It lays out the standard and the goal to remain committed to cost competitiveness in service to both our wholesale and retail customers. So if you go out and read Board Strategic Directive number 4, you will see benchmarks and targets in terms of cost competitiveness for both NPPD's wholesale rates and retail rates. And over the past several years, NPPD has been among the lowest cost energy providers in the nation. And so as we set out to plan for our long-term future, we want to remain cost competitive. We want to remain in that group of lowest cost providers. And then finally, BPSD05, which is the most recent board strategic directive. It has to do with carbon emission reductions. And board strategic directive number 5, it is out there under nppd.com/IRP, along with these other strategic directives, 4 short paragraphs, but in essence, SD05 recognizes the business risk of carbon emissions and emission regulations and establishes the goal of achieving net zero carbon emissions from our generation resources by the year 2050. So we can talk more about BPSD05 in the Q&A if you'd like. A few things that I would like to say about SD05, which will sort of help set a foundation as we go forward and talk about the results. In terms of SD05, we're talking about business risk here. NPPD currently has a generation portfolio that serves our customer base very well. It is a diverse portfolio that is made up of coal burning resources, nuclear generation resources, natural gas fired resources, wind, solar, hydro. And we believe that maintaining that resiliency has, or that diversity of resources has benefits for our customers. But if we look at our resources today as a portfolio, the largest percentage of NPPD's resources in terms of fuel type are our carbon emitting resources, our coal-fired generation plants. And so any emission regulation or other condition that would necessitate us moving away from what is right now the largest and lowest cost part of our generation portfolio is by definition a business risk, because we would be faced with significant choices on how to replace that energy and capacity moving forward. So we've talked about load, how much native load we expect to serve in the future for our wholesale and retail customers. We've talked about the market and how we buy and sell energy from the market and how those interactions can affect us in the future. We've talked just a little bit about carbon scenarios, and Jim Fair, when he gets on in just a minute, is going to explain how we modeled different assumptions or different scenarios around potential carbon regulations and SD05. But I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about resources now. As I mentioned to you, NPPD has a current generation portfolio. It's a portfolio that has served NPPD's customers well for the last several decades. When we do an integrated resource plan, we have to provide in the form of options choices for this computer simulation model to determine which is most optimal under given sets of conditions. And so for each of NPBD's existing resources, we had to determine which options the model had to choose from as it goes through its 30-year planning process. So here I want to share the options that we modeled for 3 of NPBD's major generation assets. The first set of options was for Cooper Nuclear Station. Cooper Nuclear Station is our 800 megawatt nuclear plant. It's just outside of Brownville, Nebraska. And that nuclear plant was commissioned in 1974, was relicensed, and is will approach the end of its current operating license in the year 2034. So we've already extended the operating license at Cooper once. And so in this year's planning process, we wanted to explore 2 options with regard to Cooper Nuclear Station. The first would be to pursue a second license extension, which would take Cooper's operating life from 2034 to 2054. The second option would be to allow its current operating license to expire at the end of year 2034. The reason that it's important to explore this now is that relicensing a nuclear plant is a long-term process. There is a lot of engineering, a lot of formalities that we need to go through with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in order to get the approval to pursue that relicensing. There may be certain upgrades and capital investments we would need to make. And so that's really a decision, even though our current operating license is out to 2034, that we need to be pondering and making the decision whether to pursue here in the next few years. With regard to Gerald Gentleman Station, this is our largest overall generation campus. It's a 2-unit coal-fired plant, 1,365 megawatts in total, sits west of North Platte, outside of Sutherland, Nebraska. Gerald Gentleman Station is essentially our lowest cost generation resource in terms of resources that burn some sort of fuel. And so we allowed the model to explore 3 options with regard to Gerald Gentleman Station. One is to continue to operate GGS on coal. The second would be to allow the installation of carbon capture and sequestration equipment on Unit 2, beginning in the year 2028. And the third option would be to allow the model to shut down Gerald Gentleman Station, but no sooner than the year 2030. So essentially, as we construct these options in the computer simulation model, we have to basically define the option in terms of what it is and when it's available as a choice during this optimization process. The reason we choose 2028 in regard to carbon capture and sequestration is it would take time to engineer and construct and commission that modification to Gerald Gentleman Station. So we have to be realistic about the time frame in which it could be achieved. Similarly, when we put shutdown as an option for a unit, we have to allow ourselves time to determine and then engineer, construct, and commission a replacement asset. So those are why we put various timeframes in. And the timeframes that are shown here are simply the start year. So the computer model can choose to do this in any subsequent year, but no sooner than the year listed here. Finally, with regard to Sheldon Station, Sheldon Station is a smaller coal-fired power plant in NPBD's portfolio. I believe it's 225 megawatts. sits south of Lincoln outside of Hallam, Nebraska. And for Sheldon Station, we constructed 3 options for the computer model to explore. Continue to operate Sheldon Station on coal, restore natural gas as Sheldon Station's primary fuel, beginning in the year 2028, or else allowing the early shutdown of Sheldon Station beginning in the year 2028. So again, you're seeing those start years as a possibility. 2028 is key for Sheldon Station because of there are some environmental regulations that will require some modest investment at Sheldon Station. And if we do or do not choose to make those modest investments, it will have an impact on what fuel Sheldon Station can use going forward. And so that's why the year 2028 was chosen. Jim will talk more about these options and which ones the model would suggest are optimal when we get to the results part of tonight's presentation. So we talked a little bit about NPPD's existing resources and the options that we allowed the computer model to explore. But essentially, as I said earlier, this computer simulation takes us on a 30-year journey into the future. And we're starting that journey with a certain resource mix. And we're allowing the computer optimization to choose whether to continue to operate certain parts of NPPD's resource mix or change them in some significant way, as in the case of carbon capture at GGS, or in the case of a second relicensure of Cooper Nuclear Station. Those would be significant modifications, or betterments is the term that the model would use. But we also feed into the model a number of candidate resources. So what else could we add to our resource portfolio, either as an addition in the case of our load is growing and we need more resources to serve that load, or as a replacement to one of NPPD's existing resources, if that would appear to be more optimal than keeping that existing resource going. And so in the next slide, I'm going to show you the candidate resources that were explored in the model. But first, I want to talk to you just a little bit about how we compare candidate resources. And candidate resources, as you're going to see on the next slide, each has certain advantages and challenges. But in general, we thought a good way to think about that is to think about those resources in terms of certain categories. So on this slide, you see 5 categories: cost, risk, CO2, operating flexibility, and capacity. We can compare, and in fact, the model does compare various candidate resources on a quantitative way to express these characteristics that you're seeing in front of you. With regard to cost, we think about the stability and maturity of the initial capital cost. How certain are we that we could construct and commission a certain resource for a given cost? Is it pretty well-known technology? Is it widely used in the industry? Or is it an emerging technology? Those are important considerations. Also, how favorable do the operating costs of that unit compare to potential substitutes, right? Is the fuel and operation cost more or less than a different resource that would fill a similar need in your resource mix? With regard to risk, we look at things like the maturity of the underlying technology. Has it been around and is it well known and understood, or is it more, again, of an emerging technology? Could we have a high confidence that if we were to choose to pursue this new resource, that we could construct and operate it on time in terms of having it be there at the time when we're expected to need it as part of our portfolio? This is a key concern, especially as we consider potential new nuclear assets, because they have a history of of being hard to predict in terms of both the overall cost and the time to construct and operate. CO2 is pretty easy to grasp. Right now, any conventional resource that burns some sort of fuel is going to have most likely some level of CO2 emissions associated with it. Our coal-fired assets have the most, the highest intensity of carbon emissions. Resources that burn natural gas would emit about half of that CO2. Of course, wind and solar have no carbon emissions associated with them, so that's an important a point of comparison. But even some conventional resources right now, and in fact, we explored as part of our candidate resources the assumption that were we to pursue a new fossil fuel burning resource, it would be burning either natural gas or diesel fuel as its primary fuel. But more and more conventional resources are starting to have the ability to burn non-traditional fuels. And by non-traditional fuels, I mean things like hydrogen or ammonia. Those are two emerging fuel sources that do not have associated with them significant levels or any levels of carbon emissions and can be produced in sustainable ways. So again, those are important considerations as we look to the future and whether and how much fuel burning conventional assets we need in our resource mix. Operating flexibility. This has to do with the ability to be dispatched. As I said, we buy and sell energy from the SPP market. In times of high load or in times when load is changing, can that resource ramp up and down to match the load? Because in the bulk electric system, the transmission grid, the Eastern Interconnect of which we are a part, we have to match load to generation in every second of every hour of every day of every week of every year. So we need resources that are able to follow load. How flexible and fast can those resources respond? All of those are important and are things that we model as we talk about operating flexibility. And then finally, this idea of capacity. When you construct a generation resource and you commission it, it will have associated with it what's called its nameplate capacity. Its nameplate capacity is usually determined by the manufacturer and is similar or analogous to thinking about the horsepower of your car. It is essentially the maximum amount of power that you can get from that resource when called upon for a momentary moment in time, or if you have your foot on the gas as you go down the highway, it's the maximum amount of power that resource can deliver. So we could construct a combined cycle, natural gas fired combined cycle plant that has a nameplate capacity of say 200 megawatts. Similarly, we could construct and commission a wind farm that in total for the campus, depending on how many turbines are on that campus, it could also have a nameplate capacity of 200 megawatts. There's another important consideration when we talk about capacity, and that's the term accredited capacity. Accredited capacity is determined by, in this case, our regional transmission organization, the Southwest Power Pool, and has to do with how much of an asset's nameplate capacity they will accredit to serve load during your highest expected peak hour. There are different methodologies that regional transmission organizations like the Southwest Power Pool use to determine what an accredited capacity is for a given asset. But the reason it's important is that NPPD has to construct a generation portfolio that has enough accredited capacity to serve our expected summer peak load. We're a summer peaking utility, which means that the highest load that we encounter is usually in the late July, sometimes early August timeframe. And we have to have enough accredited capacity in our generation resource to serve that peak hour, plus a certain percentage above that called a planning reserve margin. So in the case of Southwest Power Pool, that planning reserve margin is 15%. So if NPPD's summer peak load is, let's say, 3,000 megawatts, we have to have enough accredited capacity to serve that 3,000 megawatts plus 15% over and above that. The reason this is important to discuss is that some assets, namely usually conventional resources, tend to be accredited at something very close to their nameplate capacity. So that 200 megawatt combined cycle plant that I just mentioned, if that's its nameplate capacity, its accredited capacity is likely to be something very close to 200 megawatts, assuming that it operates reliably when called upon to do so. In contrast to that, renewable resources, because of the intermittency of the fuel service or the fuel availability, generation resources such as wind and solar are typically accredited at a fraction of their nameplate capacity. It's just the reality of the intermittency associated with those resources. They're very good energy producing resources, but in the peak hours of the summer, the wind in particular may not be there. So that 200 megawatt wind farm that we constructed may have an accredited capacity of 15 to 20% of that 200 megawatts. If we constructed and commissioned a 200 megawatt solar farm, by contrast, it fares better because generally in the Southwest Power Pool, the highest peak hour is going to be in the summer, presumably during the day when the sun is shining on a hot day. And so solar resources in the Southwest Power Pool typically accredited somewhere around 60 to 65% of their nameplate capacity. So all of these things we have to take into account when we're trying to construct a resource portfolio that serves our customers well, because each generation resource has advantages in terms of cost, risk, CO2, operating characteristics, and capacity, and they all have challenges. The final slide I'm going to share with you over here on the left are the various candidate resources that we allowed the model to consider as either additions or replacements to NPPD's current assets. So we explored combined cycle units, both with and without carbon capture. Combined cycle units typically burn natural gas. They're a combination of what we call combustion turbines, which are essentially jet engines, and also a steam turbine. So there's some combination usually, or a typical configuration is 2 combustion turbines married to 1 steam turbine. You capture the waste heat off of the combustion turbine and use that to drive the steam turbine to generate even more electricity for greater efficiency. So we explored combined cycle units both with and without carbon capture. We explored combustion turbines on their own. Very good quick start resources, tend to be expensive to operate, but for those few hours when you're experiencing your peak load, they can be very good sources of capacity. We also explored reciprocating internal combustion engines, or as we characterize or call them, RICE units. These are big piston powered generators similar to the diesel engine in a semi truck or trailer. So on a very large scale, generally can burn a variety of fuels, natural gas, diesel, any number of fuels they can be outfitted to burn as well. Also good quick start resources, good for load following. We looked at small modular reactors. That's an emerging technology. These are typically smaller nuclear power plants that are made in a more of an assembly line is not the perfect term, but they're meant to be faster to install, have more flexible operating characteristics, require less people to operate them, and thus have a lower cost profile. The issue with small modular reactors, and you can see here the cost is red and the risk is yellow. This is really right now we would characterize as an emerging technology. There's a number of them that are being planned or under construction, but there hasn't been one commissioned yet in the United States. So this is something that we explored. And in fact, Jim's going to talk more about this in his presentation. But again, we're exploring both well-known conventional assets and also some emerging technologies, and we'll continue to do that as we do future IRPs. And then finally, the well-known renewable resources, wind, solar, and battery. We explored all of those as candidate resources. You can see here in the sort of colored dots how we engineers attempted to categorize whether a particular characteristic was an advantage or a challenge. This is not perfect. As I said, we would characterize the cost of small modular reactors as a challenge. We would consider the capacity, the accredited capacity of wind and solar potentially to be a challenge in terms of it would be difficult to construct an entire accredited portfolio out of just wind and solar due to the decrement of the methodology and accrediting those types of resources. But just looking at this chart in total, as you look at the red, yellow, and green dots, what I hope you take away from this is the fact that there is no perfect energy source right now. Each type of resource, whether it's one of NPPD's existing resources or whether it's a candidate resource that we explored in the IRP, has advantages and challenges. And it's our challenge as resource planners to construct a portfolio that meets those four goals of reliability and resiliency, affordability and sustainability by taking advantage of what these resources do well while mitigating the challenges that they have. And traditionally, NPPD has been successful at that through maintaining a diverse generation resource mix. And so as we look at the results now, as I turn this over to Jim, let's keep that thought in mind. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Jim Fair, and he's going to get to the exciting part of this presentation and talk about the insights that we gained from the IRP. Jim?
Thanks, Jason. Let's go ahead and move on through to the results. As Jason said, I'll take you through the results. And the first one here, before we get into the results, so I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about the Inflation Reduction Act. We started this process, our integrated resource planning process, back in late 2021. And by early 2022, we had our assumptions down. We were putting the information in the model. We were making some preliminary runs and trying to understand what some of the results were telling us. And we were getting close to getting all those done and writing the report and going down that path when in August of last year, Congress passed the IRA. And that could have that can have an impact because there are credits that go to renewables, to nuclear, batteries, existing nuclear, a number of different, and carbon capture, sequestration, a number of different technologies. We could wait for the information and then try to rerun it, or we could move forward with it. as you can tell, we're still waiting for some guidance from the IRS. So we're still don't have that information. So what we did is we took some of the information, some of the background information we got from the IRA legislation, did some high-level calculations. How much would we get for credits if it was carbon capture sequestration or new small modular reactors or wind and renewables and solar? And we put that into the draft report for a high level. And as Jason mentioned, you know, the IRP is meant to be directionally correct. So as we dig into various options and get a little more information, we'll utilize better information from these IRA credits when we do that analysis. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And so as Jason talked, you know, that these assumptions, we have variables, and we want to understand what the impact of those variables might mean, so we can have a signpost. So if the load is higher or less than what we have, that tells us something and tells us where to what we might want to look at in more detail. Before we get into the graphs, if you look at the x-axis on the bottom, there's an acronym NPV that stands for net present value, and that's a economic way to take a series of cash flows and compress it into one number. And that way you can look at that one number and compare it to another resource plan that has one number to come up with what is the most economically attractive plan in that regard. These cash flows, they're by year. They have debt service to pay off, you know, new units that we're putting into service. It includes operation and maintenance costs. It includes, you know, fuel to, if we have to burn fuel to generate electricity for our customers. So, so that's the net present value, and it's the net present value of revenue requirements, which is just a way of saying that is a cost that we have to capture from our native load customers, to be able to recover all our costs. As you're aware, Nebraska Public Power is a public utility. We don't have ratepayers. We don't, or excuse me, not we don't have stockholders. So we're beholden to the ratepayers, and we're to pay to capture those costs, and our costs that we occur to serve you our electricity, and we need to recover those from the prices that we're charging you. So the higher the number, the net present value, the more costs that has to be recovered. And you can see at the very top, load has the most is the most uncertain of these variables. At the very high end, and it's probably, if you think about it, the more load there is, the more megawatt hours that we have to serve, the more resources we need, which means we'll have to pay for that, the capital cost to install it. The more energy we have to produce, and that can mean the operation and maintenance or the fuel costs of that. So that's why that's higher. The higher the load, the higher the cost. For carbon dioxide, the more restrictive the scenario is, and I'll talk about the three scenarios we looked at, the more costly it is. So when you think of that restrictions, I like to use an example. If you have one grocery store and you need a gallon of milk, you have to go to that grocery store and buy that milk. You pay whatever they're charging. If you have 4 or 5 grocery stores, you have options that you can hopefully go to the one that has a lower cost and get that low cost and save money. So with these CO2 scenarios, you're restricted to no carbon or very low carbon resources. And that doesn't give you the full gambit of possibilities of potential cost reduction. So the more restrictive the CO2, the higher the cost. The last one is market price, which in this case means the wholesale price that MPPD will pay or get when we take our energy or our resources out to the wholesale market, which is in the Southwest Power Pool. So we'll buy and sell power there to be able to deliver the energy to you, our customers. So that has the least amount of risk or variation. So, okay, let's go to the next slide. So here's the results for the carbon dioxide emissions. And first of all, I want to talk a little bit of what is net zero. That's the board policy strategic directive said we want to be net zero by 2050. What exactly, how did we take that wording and put it into the model? A couple of years ago, we had what we called a Plan B analysis. That was a nickname for it. I can't even recall what the official name was, but it was always called Plan B. And really what that did is it looked at different options. What happens if there was some carbon restrictions? So one of the consultants that we hired came back and said, you absolute zero is if you have no carbon emissions whatsoever when you're producing electricity. They said that was very, very, very expensive to get to that net zero. If you could get to 90% of the way there, but to get that last 10% was extremely costly with the technology we know today. And that was very close to other industry-wide studies we saw in the 10-20% range, where they said you could get down to 10 or 20%, but getting all the way to net zero or to absolute zero is very costly. So for net zero, what we're looking at is taking our total load that we have to serve in 2050 and saying 10% of that can be served by carbon resources. And we then said for those carbon resources, we're going to assume all of it is served by natural gas because that's the lowest carbon emitting fossil fuel. That ended up being right around 1 million megawatt hours or 1 million tons of carbon dioxide. And so that's where that you see that blue line, the orange line, they all kind of merge right there at the end at 1 million tons of CO2. It's net zero, so that other 1 million tons will use renewable energy credits or some sort of offsets to offset those carbon emissions. So going to the 3 lines or the 3 solid lines, the first one is the orange line, and that's the Strategic Directive 05. That's our board policy that says we're going to be net zero in 2050. The way we interpret it in the model is to say we're not going to have any limitations on carbon dioxide until 2050, and then it's limited to 1 million tons a year. So you can see that without any limitations on carbon dioxide, it really didn't reduce by itself. It actually bumped up and down. And this is a typical case. There were a number of them we did like that, but this was a typical one. But again, in 2049 to 2050 is almost like a cliff. That's sharp drop off to 1 million tons. The black dotted line is the second case we ran, which is net zero by 2050, but with a glide path. And as you can see, it's a linear glide path. And the solid gray line there is the actual emissions from one of the cases. So you can see when we put in these limits that are represented by the dotted lines, the actual emissions that were emitted from our units and the purchases from the market were right at that or below that dashed line. And the last case, the most restrictive, the earliest we would look at net zero emissions was by 2035. And again, a linear line from there. And so you can see that the amount is reduced much more quickly down to that 2035, and then it stays at that roughly million tons per year. Why did we use 2035? The present administration has talked about 2035 at various levels of either for electricity or from a industry-wide approach of reducing carbon. So we felt that was a possibility. We're not, as Jason mentioned earlier, you know, we're not saying that any of these are the correct ones, but we wanted to get a range. What could we expect? So if there is a more restrictive carbon legislation that comes into play, or something else that causes us to reduce carbon, we have an understanding of how we can get down to that level. So let's go to the next slide. So what did the study and the model say about some of our existing units? So first of all, I was going to talk a little bit about Cooper Nuclear Station. That is in the southeast part of our state. It is our largest non-carbon emitting resource that we have in our mix today. And the major takeaway from the studies and from the modeling is that the second relicensing, as you recall, we either said Cooper would go through a second relicensing out to 2054, or it would shut down in 2034. So in many of these cases, especially where there was more carbon restrictions, it was valuable. It was the lowest cost, but not all of them. Not all the cases were they the absolute minimum net present value. But the other thing on top of that is, with Cooper in our mix, it provides resiliency and generation diversity. It gives us a nuclear option, and the resiliency, we have that fuel on site that it can produce power. It doesn't require natural gas to be transported there every day, or it doesn't require the sun to shine or the wind to blow. It's on site. It has that fuel, and it can run 24/7. And it's also considered the least risky of the low carbon coal or nuclear options. We've operated, again, Cooper for roughly 50 years. We know how to operate that facility in a safe, reliable, resilient manner. So the other options are more what we wouldn't call them mature technology. So there's some risk, and Jason touched on that a little bit earlier. So if you go to the next slide, the action items, the proposed action items from the draft report says we're going to start proceeding with the second license renewal, and we're going to keep an eye and try to refine the capital costs. So what the numbers we put in that we feel is comfortable, is reasonable. And, you know, if some of these costs that come back, if we feel that the numbers change a lot, we still have time to look at it. But the second relicensing, to get that to begin in 2034, to start that second relicensing, we're going to need to proceed with the paperwork and some of the analysis as early as in a year or two. So it's something that we have to move forward with fairly quickly. So the next resource we want to talk about a little bit is Gerald Gentleman Station. That's our largest coal plant. It's west of North Platte. There's 2 units there, and it is a very effective, cost-effective solution for our customers today. In some of the carbon restrictive scenarios, carbon capture and sequestration appears that it could be a cost-effective, resilient solution. And the reason it was more cost-effective is the IRA credits. There's a the IRA legislation provides $85 per metric ton credit to MPPD if we would install carbon capture and sequester that coal. So every ton of carbon dioxide we sequester in the ground, the government would provide $85 back to MPPD over a 12-year period. So it is a very valuable credit in that regard, and that does make it may make that unit under carbon capture and sequestration a good, effective, cost-effective solution for MPPD. But as we talked about, it's not mature technology for that size. You know, think of and when you open up a pop can, there's carbon dioxide in it, and that had to be produced. So that technology has been around. It's just not at this scale. Okay, so that leads into what the proposed action items are. And what we're looking at is we would continue to operate Gentleman on Coal. And as Jason indicated, you know, there are risks to Gentleman for operation. Carbon is one of those risks that we will have to continue to monitor. And we want to continue to investigate carbon capture and sequestration. We've done some preliminary siting and engineering plans, but we need to make sure that the type of technology we're using is the best, has the best value, is the most reliable to use for this particular situation. Okay, next slide is on Sheldon. And Sheldon, which is south of Lincoln, about a half hour or so, is a very good location. It's close to load, so there's not a lot of transmission that you have to transmit it across to get to load. There are a lot of good transmission lines right there. And there's good natural gas lines that aren't too far away from that. So it is a very good location. And some of the results, most of the results showed that restoring natural gas as primary fuel to Sheldon could be beneficial. So when we say restoring, what we're saying is we're going to use the existing equipment there. We're just, instead of using coal, we're going to modify the burners and such to go back and burn 100% natural gas as it once did. So the action items from Sheldon. Number one is we're going to continue to pursue modifications that the Environmental Protection Agency has put down. They just have proposed some here a couple of weeks ago for the effluent limitation guideline rule. And we're going to continue to explore natural gas operation, restoration, or a new unit at that location. As we talked about, it was a very good location, and see if we can get better estimates and see which one comes out best in a additional analysis or review. So let's keep going. So some additional findings, energy efficiency and demand response. So if you're not familiar with those terms, energy efficiency is a way to reduce how much you consume all the time. A good example of that is if you put in add insulation to your house. In the winter, you're not going to have to heat the house up as much because that insulation keeps that heat in. And in the summer, you don't have to run that air conditioner as much because you can keep the cool air in more than if you don't have that amount of insulation. Excuse me. For demand response, a good example of demand response, there's a number of them, but is an industrial customer that wants to run their process 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. They want to run very constant. But if there's a few hours during the peak hours in the summer or winter, if there's a system emergency, if we can have them drop their load for those few hours, then we don't have to build that resource for that amount of reduction that they do. And that can be beneficial. And we can provide them some incentives to do that and still provide that benefit to all our customers. So what the study did find is that some larger amounts of both of those can show benefit, especially if we have more load coming online, or if there's a restriction in the amount of CO2 that we can emit. The other thing is early installation of renewable generation. That's an action item we have. The model typically waited, into the 2030s before before it installed new renewable generation. And what we wanted to do is explore maybe installing it in the late 20s, 26, 27, 28, a little bit earlier, and take and get the value of those IRA credits, those Inflation Reduction Act credits. Because again, the model didn't look at those credits initially. So when you add those credits in, it could actually make that a lower cost choice in earlier. So we want to investigate that and see if that does make sense for us. Go ahead to the next. And so again, if you recall, I said that we had to finalize our assumptions back, about a year ago already. And part of our process is to review our load growth every year when we go through our budgeting and long-term forecast analysis. So IRP is done every 5 years, but for our budget and to see how things work, we do that every year and look at a shorter term, a few years out in the future. This last go around, we had much higher load growth than what we had in our base case for the IRP. It was actually tracking at or above our high load forecast scenario. One major reason for this is due to the IRA credits. There's a lot of incentive to produce hydrogen and hydrogen type products and other type of products for a lower carbon future. Those industries will need a lot of electricity to do that, and those industries are looking at our area here in Nebraska to see if this is a good location to put down their quote stakes and run their business. So that really increased our load growth from previous years. So what we will probably look at as a part of an action item is to look at the need for securing additional capacity and energy earlier than we anticipated for the base case. And it'll be closer to our high load case, or even a little bit above that is where some of those where that new load is coming from. So let's go try to sum this up, recap it. Again, what did Jason tell you right at the very beginning? It's not the IRP is not directionally correct. It's not an exact expansion plan. It doesn't tell us we're going to put in resource A in year X and resource B in year Y, and that's how it's going to be for the next 30 years. But what it does tell us, it is directionally correct. What type of resources do we need to look at? about when would we do it? Do we need a resource when there's more load, or what can we do if we have less load, or what happens if if market prices, wholesale market prices become much higher than they are today or lower? And again, with the carbon scenarios, what happens with that? So we did those assumptions. We tried to get a wide range of assumptions. So when we look at when something happens, we can then interpolate in between those to help us understand what the right direction is. And so the initial findings, there are a few more, but I think for the ones that we want to make sure you remember is we're going to start proceeding with the second license renewal at Cooper. We're going to continue to operate our Gerald Gentleman Station on coal, but we're going to investigate carbon capture and sequestration. I should say continue to investigate that. We're going to look at adding some renewables earlier than what we have. We got to and then utilize those IRA credits to help keep those costs down. And again, the recent load projections say we might have to secure additional capacity and energy earlier than what we had originally thought. So we're going to be taking a hard look at that and making sure that we can serve our customers. So with that, I think we'll turn it back over to Courtney to do some questions and answers.
Hey, thank you, Jim and Jason. And I think at this point, we're going to pause the recording, as we'll be putting out the presentations on our website, but we'll take some time to hold it open just for a bit longer and see if there's anyone else that has any questions they'd like us to take. We'd be happy to field those. Otherwise, great opportunity to remind you there is a stakeholder input form out on our website, mppd.com/IRP. Please complete that by April 12th. So that we can incorporate it into our findings and the results of the IRP process. We really appreciate everybody joining us this evening for the virtual webinar. And if you think of anything else, please do feel free to reach out. We welcome public feedback, particularly as a public power entity. Your feedback is very important to us. So with that, unless anybody has any other questions here, kind of last call, want to thank Jim and Jason, our panelists, for doing an exceptional job walking through the IRP and all of the inputs. And again, thank everybody for joining us and for your questions. Have a great night.